Hi everyone, this is part 1 of the lecture to accompany chapter 1 in your textbook. Please read chapter 1, there's lots of information and examples that I don't have time to address. Alright, let's find out why you shouldn't believe everything you think. Chapter 1 begins with a somewhat amusing anecdote about a bank robber who gets away with his crime, but comes back to rob the same bank the next day while a news crew is filming a story about the previous robbery. The reporter recognizes him, calls the police, and this time he doesn't get away. The story is an example of someone who didn't think critically. In other words, he didn't really evaluate his thoughts and actions in any kind of rational way. He did think, and he did act, but his actions based on his thoughts weren't very wise. It's easy to make fun of this robber, but frankly, we're more like him than we are different. We all spend a lot of time thinking, but not a lot of time thinking critically, evaluating our opinions, judgments, decisions, plans, conclusions, and actions, as well as other people's. Although frankly, we tend to do it more with other people than we do with ourselves. That's because we tend to think that our own thinking is pretty darn good, but Cousin Sammy's is, well, it's just messed up. But again, you're not that different from Cousin Sammy. I like to think of humans as walking bundles of emotions with an occasional rational thought thrown in. Yes, I'm that way, and so are you. This course is designed to help you understand what critical thinking is and allows you to think about it, practice it, and apply it to your own thinking. Will it help you to win arguments with stupid people? I can't guarantee that. I can, however, guarantee that you will begin to see the errors in your own thinking and be able to critically evaluate the messages you're constantly being bombarded with out there in the world that influence your thought processes and lead you to conclusions and actions that may not be in your best interest. If this class can help you to avoid making just one unwise decision, then it will have been worth it. The goal of critical thinking is to help us to come to conclusions that are correct and lead to wise decisions. We've already spent most of our lives coming to conclusions, and we've come to a lot of them. Some of them are certainly based on rational thinking, but just as many or more are based on our emotions, how we feel about something. I mean, how often do we say, I feel like, instead of I think, when asked about a topic? That's because so much of opinions and beliefs are based on how those things make us feel. We have things like beliefs, judgments, and opinions. Those are conclusions that we've reached that we think are true. So beliefs, judgments, opinions, conclusions, those are all the same thing, and we often use them interchangeably. Beliefs are also propositional. In other words, we can phrase them as a declarative sentence. For instance, if I believe that my sister is a pretty girl, then I can state that as a declarative sentence. My sister is pretty. Once I've done that, my belief that I put into this declarative sentence is known as a claim. Other terms for claims are statements or assertions. Claims can either be objective claims or subjective claims. The claim, my sister is pretty, is a subjective claim. Let's find out why. Objective claims are those whose truth or falsity does not depend on whether someone thinks they're true or false. It is objectively true or false no matter what your belief about it is. The example here, the earth is a sphere, is an objective claim because there is a truth that exists about it outside of any opinion you or the rapper B.O.B. might have about it. Subjective claims, on the other hand, are definitely dependent on whether people think they're true or false. Here's an example. Beyonce is a better singer than Whitney Houston ever was. You might think that's true, or you might think that's some total BS, but there's no definitive way to prove that it is either true or false. It's simply a matter of taste. So my claim that my sister is pretty is subjective. I might think so, you might think so or not, but frankly, since standards of beauty vary by culture and by individual taste, there's no definitive way to prove whether she is or is not pretty. Even claims where there's a lot of argument can be objective. For instance, God exists is an objective claim because despite what any one of us believes, there is an ultimate truth outside of our beliefs. We might think we know what it is, but frankly, we don't. The truth or falseness of the claim that God exists lies outside of our ability to discern it, but it is still there. So that's an objective claim. So now let's see if you can tell which of these claims is subjective and which is objective. You can stop the recording if you need a moment to figure it out. Once you think you've got it, continue with the lecture. So the claims in red, 1, 3, and 5, are subjective claims. 2 and 4 are objective claims. 1 is subjective because the phrase too sweet could mean different things to different people. What I think is too sweet, someone else might think is not sweet enough. 2 is objective because it is either true or false, and you could actually set up your own little experiment to determine the truth or falseness of this claim. 3 is subjective because what it means to be competent could vary among individuals. 4 is objective because you have ways to find out exactly how many authors collaborated on an article, like actually reading the list of authors or asking them. 5 is subjective because what overpriced means varies. How much would someone pay for a share of Microsoft anyway? One expert might say this, but another one might say the opposite. Objective and subjective claims may seem pretty cut and dried. However, there are some aspects of the way groups of humans think that cause some gray areas in this discussion. Remember, we've determined that objective claims are either true or false, irrespective of whether people think they're true or false. But there's something called relativism, which is the idea that truth is relative to the standards of a given culture. In this way of viewing truth, there's no way to argue that particular standards of one culture are more correct than standards of another. And there's also something called moral subjectivism, which is the idea that what is right and what is wrong is merely a matter of subjective opinion, and what might be right for me might be wrong for you. These ideas can and should certainly be debated philosophically, and even sometimes might make sense. However, you need to consider again that truth exists outside of our opinions. For instance, the book gives this example. If someone thinks it's perfectly fine to stone women to death for adultery, that you should say, oh well, that's what they think, and who am I to think otherwise? You probably wouldn't do that, nor should you. The truth that it's a really bad idea to throw stones at women exists outside of someone's belief that is justified. So yeah, it can get complicated, but we're humans. We are complicated. We will be using the term issues a lot. An issue is simply a question that has been raised. Basically, it's the topic at the heart of a claim. Now, that sounds simple, but in a lot of discussions, arguments, and persuasive messages, the issue can be difficult to determine. You can get sidetracked very easily, so finding the heart of the matter is imperative. Let's look at the following argument. Let me tell you why Hank ought not to take that math course. First, it's too hard and he'll probably flunk it. Second, he's going to spend the whole term in a state of frustration. Third, he'll probably get depressed and do poorly in all the rest of his courses. Now, there's a lot of statements that are being made here, but what is the primary issue? Is it whether Hank would flunk the math course? Whether Hank will spend the whole term in a state of frustration? Whether Hank will get depressed and do poorly in all the rest of his courses? Or whether Hank ought to take the math course? If you said it is the last one, whether Hank ought to take the math course, you're right. Everything else in that argument is a reason why he shouldn't take the math course. So, what question is being asked and answered here? It's, should Hank take the math course? Here's another argument. The defeat of the school voucher initiative was a bad thing for the country because now public schools won't have any incentive to clean up their act. Furthermore, the defeat perpetuates the private school for the rich, public school for the poor syndrome. What's the primary issue? Is it whether the private school for the rich, public school for the poor syndrome will be perpetuated? Whether the defeat of the school voucher initiative was bad for the country? Or whether public schools now have any incentive to clean up their act? The primary issue is the second statement there, whether the defeat of the school voucher initiative was bad for the country. The other statements are reasons why it was bad, and they answer the question, was the defeat of the school voucher initiative bad for the country? I hope you can see that. Here are two people talking about toilet paper. Elmop says, toilet paper looks better unwinding from the back of the spool. Marwolf says, get real, that's so stupid, it should unwind the other way. So the question is Marwolf addressing the issue that's raised by Elmop? What is the issue? Well, it's that toilet paper should unwind from the back of the spool, and his reason is because it looks better. So yes, Marwoof is addressing the same issue, whether toilet paper should unwind from the back of the spool. He just has a different way of looking at it, but it is the same issue. Here's a bit trickier one. Are these two addressing the same issue? Mr. RJ says, if you ask me, there are too many casinos around here already. We don't need more. Mr. JR's response is, yeah, well, that's a strange idea coming from you. You play the lottery all the time. So, is JR addressing the issue raised by RJ? Let's look at what exactly the issue is. RJ is making the claim that we don't need more casinos, and his reasoning is that there are too many around here already. So the question being raised is, do we need more casinos? Now, let's look at JR's response. Yeah, well, that's a strange idea coming from you. You play the lottery all the time. Is he addressing the question, do we need more casinos? No, he isn't. It may seem that way because casinos and lotteries are both ways of gambling, but that's only tangentially related. JR is making a completely different claim about a different issue, that RJ's idea about casinos is strange. Although they might seem connected, these two people are arguing about two different things. And I'll bet you've probably done that too. Okay, so this one's similar. Katie says, hey, Jennifer, I hate to say this, but you would be better off riding a bike to school. Jennifer's response is what? This from someone who drives everywhere she goes? Katie's issue comes down to the question, should Jennifer ride a bike to school? Jennifer is not addressing that question at all, instead focusing on the fact that Katie drives everywhere she goes. Underneath it is likely the expression of an opinion that someone who drives so much has no business telling her to ride a bike, yet it is still about something else, not about whether or not she should ride a bike. So let's get right to the heart of critical thinking, the argument. When we think of an argument, we tend to think of emotionally charged debates or differences of opinion that you have with someone, usually with people you're related to, or even a disagreement that ends up in an actual physical fight. Those kinds of things can be mentally, emotionally, and sometimes physically painful and can lead to hurt feelings and even sometimes arrest and incarceration. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about here. The term argument is a formal term used in critical thinking and philosophy, and it's a different thing altogether. An argument presents a consideration for accepting a claim and consists of two parts, the premise or premises, or reason or reasons, and the conclusion or the claim that you want to prove. So in an argument, one part, the premise, gives a reason for accepting the other part, the conclusion. Here's a very simple example. You shouldn't buy that car. It's really ugly. The issue here is not whether the car is ugly or not. It's whether you should buy it or not. So that's the main claim being made, also known as the conclusion. The other claim, that it's ugly, is the premise or the reason that you shouldn't buy it. You'll be doing exercises that help you determine the different parts of an argument. They start out very simple like this one, but after some practice, you should be able to pick the conclusions out of fairly long and complicated arguments. Okay, so let's do a little exercise. Once I explain it to you, stop the recording and try to figure out which statements are premises and which are conclusions in each of these arguments. Once you think you know, start the recording to see if you got them right. Now, there are 3 separate arguments here about separate topics. Okay, stop the recording and try to figure it out. Here are the arguments. The conclusions or main claims of each argument is in red lettering. The premises, which are the reasons or evidence for accepting the conclusions, are in purple lettering. The first argument about chemicals in teething rings has the conclusion in the first sentence. This person wants you to believe that fears about chemicals in teething rings might be justified. What evidence are they using for the premise? A Consumer Product Safety Commission report about a chemical that exists in these rings that has been known to cause cancer in lab animals. In the second argument, the conclusion is in the last sentence that we will have to find someone else who owns a truck. And the reason for that is Carl will be out of town, so he can't help. In the final example, the conclusion is in the first sentence. The claim is that computers will never be able to converse intelligently through speech. What is the person using as evidence of this? The example showing that sentences often sound alike and that a computer might not be able to discern between them. Did you get them right? I hope so, but if you didn't, don't worry, you'll have a lot more chances to get it right. Before we go any further, I just want to point out that some things can be mistaken for arguments, but they're actually serving another purpose. Explanations, for instance, often look like arguments, but they're not. Explanations are simply that. They explain why something is the way it is. It's not an argument if the person is just giving you information about the cause of something. So here are two examples. I was late for work because my car broke down explains the reason for the person being late. The Titanic sank because it struck an iceberg is an explanation. The person's not trying to convince anyone of it, just explaining the cause. Let's see if you can tell the difference. Decide if these statements are arguments or explanations. Stop the recording, and when you think you know the answers, start it again. The sentences in red lettering are explanations. The purple ones are arguments. I got sick because I didn't get enough rest over the weekend. This person is not arguing that this and not something else is the cause of their illness. They're just explaining why they got sick. The governor should resign because everyone has lost faith in his leadership ability. This is an argument. The claim is that the governor should resign, and the evidence to prove he should resign is that everyone has lost faith in him. Pine trees are called evergreens because they don't lose their leaves is an explanation. This is a statement of fact. Nobody is meant to argue with it. You are making a mistake wearing that outfit because it looks tacky is an argument. You're making a mistake wearing that outfit is the conclusion, the evidence being that it looks tacky. This final one is a little tricky based on the last statement, but it's an explanation for why Jennifer doesn't wear outfits like that, not an argument that she shouldn't. It gives a reason why she doesn't. This is the end of part 1. Please move on to part 2.